Hello, and welcome to my presentation on using equity for everyone, specifically using data to develop continuous improvement plans to benefit an entire campus. My name is Matthew DeSantis, and I'm the Director for Institutional Assessment at St. Edward's University. I want to first start by saying how honored I am to take part in this wonderful certificate of culturally responsive assessment at Lindenwood University. It's a real privilege and honor to be speaking with all of you today. And I hope that you all gain a great deal out of this presentation. And you can always feel free to contact me afterwards. I've included my contact information at the end of the presentation. But I am excited to talk to you today about some of the work that we've done at St. Edward's University that I think is really translatable to many different institutions in a lot of different capacities, both curricular as well as co-curricular. So a little bit about myself to get started, just so you're acquainted with where I'm coming from professionally. I have a background as a faculty member. I was a political science faculty member to start my career. I taught at the University of Texas at El Paso, at High Point University in North Carolina, and at Guilford Technical Community College in North Carolina. And so for the first 9 years of my career, I was focused solely on being a faculty member. It was during my time at Guilford Technical Community College that I started to take on responsibilities focused on assessment and accreditation. We were about 18 months out from our 10-year reaffirmation, and I got a phone call. That's how a lot of these stories start. But I got a phone call regarding the need for someone to lead the assessment committee. And that led to a lot of other professional activities and a lot of other professional developments over the next several years. And so I became very enthralled with the work of assessment and accreditation, and we successfully got through our 10-year reaffirmation. And that was so exciting for me that I then sought out a full-time position in assessment and accreditation at Florida Southern College. And that has now led me to my position at St. Edward's University, where I am the Director for Institutional Assessment and work within a larger office of institutional effectiveness and planning. One of the things I do want to stress before we get started is that having been at several different institutions and having led assessment at 3 different institutions now, I can tell you that assessment looks different everywhere I've been. There is not one correct way to do assessment. And ultimately, you need to find a way that is true to the culture of your institution. And you need to find a way that is true to the culture of your office in some cases, or your department, or your program. And it's okay for assessment not to look the same across an entire institution even. So working with those different stakeholders to make sure that they're getting something useful out of assessment, but what assessment looks like may be very different depending on the type of institution and the type of program that they're running. So the outline for the presentation today is I want to tell you a little bit about St. Edward's, and I think it's important to have an understanding of where we as an institution are coming from, so that when you're thinking about how do we replicate perhaps some of these practices at Lindenwood, or if you move on to other institutions, understanding the conditions that are present at St. Edward's and how that either helped the process along or perhaps even hindered the process. Maybe Lindenwood may be further along on some of these initiatives, and therefore you may be able to make quicker headway on some of these ideas than we were able to at St. Edward's. Then we'll kind of go into 2 different case studies, if you will, maybe 2.5, and I'll explain the and a half later. But focusing on assessment and student activities. So this was the first entree into equity-based assessment at St. Edward's. And so talking about that process and assessing on the co-curricular side. And then the transition to how do we do this assessment on the curricular side of the house? And how do we make sure that the data is meaningful for both the co-curricular and the curricular? And how do we make sure that there is institutional-wide buy-in and ownership across all of these. And then finally, we'll finish with some lessons learned from the process. So a little bit about St. Edward's University. It's a university that, I'll be honest, I was not particularly aware of before I applied for a job here. So if you've not heard of it, don't feel bad. I didn't hear about it before I saw the job posting. So a little bit about St. Edward's. We're located in Austin, Texas, and it is a lovely campus that actually is set a little bit outside of the city, about probably 2 miles from downtown. And we're on a little ridge, and we have the absolute best view of the skyline of Austin, which is filled with cranes and a lot of construction material, but it is ever changing, but it is still a beautiful sight to see. We are a private institution, and we are a Catholic institution that's very focused and grounded in the liberal arts. And that religious connection is going to be very important for something I mentioned in a moment. We have about 3,800 overall students. Those numbers, I think that's pretty reflective of where we are right now this fall. We were a little bit higher, obviously, prior to the pandemic, closer to 4,000, but we're at 3,800. The vast majority of those are undergraduate students, but we do have growing graduate programs. We started our first doctoral program in higher education leadership. We have several other graduate programs in both the School of Business as well as higher education or education-based graduate programs. We are a Hispanic serving institution. This is something that's very important to us. Over 40% of our student body is identified as Latinx, and that is something that we take very seriously. As I mentioned down below, we have the longest running camp program. Now, what is camp? For those of you who may not be familiar, it is a program that provides a full ride, tuition, fees, room and board, the whole 9 yards, to first generation children of migrant worker. So children of migrant workers, and these are students who, in the case of St. Edward's, overwhelmingly come from the Rio Grande Valley. And we bring in about 35 of those students every single year. These are students who have an academic profile that might lend you to think one thing, but their success and graduation rates often surpass even our highest profile students. So it is a program that is really amazing to see and truly life-changing for not only the students, but for the parents and the family. And so we have the longest continuous running camp program in the country. And that's something we're very proud of. Over 40% of our students are Pell eligible. So even though we are a private institution, we do have a significant number of students who have need and are coming from more working class or middle class backgrounds. Overall, we have around 500 faculty between full-time and part-time faculty members. And what I mentioned here at the bottom is kind of maybe a jumping off point for the larger discussion we're going to have today, which is that we are a social justice-based institution. That is at the heart of our mission, social justice and equity. And it is with that in mind that we really were able to transform assessment at St. Edward's so that it reflected the mission of the institution. And this is something I'm going to come back to again and again. By the end of the presentation, you're probably going to be sick and tired of hearing me say it. But if you are able to align what you do in assessment with the mission and strategic plan of an institution, you're going to be incredibly successful, in my opinion, because you are going to get buy-in from everyone from administration to staff to faculty to students, because the mission should be driving what we're doing as an institution. It should be driving that strategic plan. And if you can show that assessment is not this additional burden that people have to bear, but rather showing that it highlights the mission of the institution. Why are we here? Who are we serving, and why are we serving them, and how are we serving them? That's where you really have a breakthrough. So we were able to align a social justice mission with our assessment process through the use of data. And I think that's a really interesting story to tell, and one I'm looking forward to talking to you about today. The other thing I wanted to provide is some context about the capacity at St. Edward's. Uh, I, I'll just tell you a brief anecdote. When I first started doing assessment, I went to an assessment conference, and I got my program, as we all do when we get to these conferences. I'm thumbing through, or I was maybe even, this is before all of them were apps. And so I was actually thumbing physically through the program. And I found a really great session. I didn't look at the institution, but I saw the session and I said, oh, this is a great title, great abstract. I'm really excited about this. And I go in, and the person started the presentation somewhat similar to this and said, we have an office of 22 people in institutional research and assessment. And I was coming from Guilford Tech, where I and my co-chair on the Learning Evidence Committee were the only people who were leading assessment. And we had 2 people in an institutional research office, and they didn't know anything about assessment. So I just kind of got up and politely left that presentation, because I realized that as helpful as that information may have been for them, they were just, from an institutional standpoint, they had so much more capacity to do things than what I had the capacity to do at this time. And so I wanted to share some of where we are as an institution with all of you, so that you can get a sense of scale. Maybe Lindenwood has more capacity, maybe a little bit less, but understanding, okay, this is about where we are, and maybe this is what's feasible to accomplish, et cetera. So about 3.5 years ago, 4 years ago, St. Edward's went through a reorganization in which institutional research and institutional assessment were blended together under one office of institutional effectiveness and planning. And my current vice president is the one who led this reorganization. It was interesting, when I arrived at St. Edward's, I arrived a few months after this reorganization started, and we got together as a group for a lunch at our cafeteria. And there was a person who had worked in institutional research for over 20 years, and a person who had worked in assessment for over 10 years, and yet they hardly knew each other. And that was really striking to me, because in my world, coming from Florida Southern prior to St. Edward's, institutional research and assessment were always in one office, and we always worked very closely with another, but that was not always the case at St. Edward's. So this reorganization combined our offices. It also brought business analytics under institutional effectiveness and planning. So we have another member on our team who's devoted to that. As I say here, we currently have 4.5 full-time equivalent staffing. We have my vice president, myself as director for institutional assessment. We have a director for institutional research, and then we have a senior business analyst for business analytics who controls a lot of our data warehouse and does a lot with visualizations that I'm going to be talking about in a second. From a technology standpoint, when we went through the reorganization, we also started partnering with an organization called Heliocampus. This is not a plug for you to use them, but just to let you know how we went about this process. Heliocampus provides a service where they clean up and create extracts of institutional data. So we use Banner as our student information system. They're able to go in, clean up that information, and make it into an extract that you're then able to pull into other pieces of software. The primary one I list down below. We also became a Tableau campus for visualization purposes. So I can go into Tableau and I can pull in the enrollments extract from Banner, which is created by Heliocampus, or curated by Heliocampus, I should say. And I can pull in any number of variables and look up students and bring in different aspects of that student record, looking very granularly, or I can look big picture at enrollment trends over time, et cetera. So the partnership of Heliocampus and Tableau, while not a joint partnership, very much so blended together nicely, in that we were able to get clean, reliable institutional data, which is really important. And then through that process, we were able to have it easily accessed and easily visualized in Tableau. So that was very, very critical. And then from a curricular standpoint, we adopted a new general education curriculum in 2018. So this was a major shift that had taken place on our campus. Our previous general education curriculum had been in place for over 20 years. So this was a huge shift for the faculty and for the institution to move to a new general education curriculum. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when we get into the assessment of the gen ed here in a moment. But before we do, I really wanted to focus on the assessment and student activities. And so just to let you know, if you're wondering why there's a goat, St. Edward's mascot is the hilltop. We're the hilltoppers, and that's a little goat. And so our hand signal down here in Texas, you do kind of a crooked fingers, and this is our little, everybody down in Texas has a hand signal. So it's the Longhorns, the Red Raiders are two kind of guns in the air. The UTEP miners are a pickaxe that you wave back and forth. Everybody's got a hand signal. Baylor, which is the Bears, is just like a big bear claw. You just kind of put your hands up and make a bear claw. So there's a TCU one, which is the Horned Toads, which I think is something like this. That's a tough one to do. But at St. Edward's, it's the Hilltoppers. And so we have our little goat hand signals. But this is Topper, the goat. And so students love to meet with Topper when they come on campus. And one of those times is certainly orientation. This was one of the first things I did when I arrived at St. Edward's, was work with the orientation staff. There had been a lot of turnover in that area before my arrival. And there were a lot of things that had been on the books, so to speak, for quite a while. One of those was outcomes. Nobody owned outcomes at regarding orientation or in student affairs, because they had been created by someone else years previously. And so when it came time to actually look at the sort of goals and outcomes that the institution wanted to achieve in that particular area, no one felt a sense of connection or ownership to those goals or outcomes. This was a real problem. We also had an issue of data collection being in a silo. This was a larger challenge that we had institutionally. This was not just true for orientation staff or student activity staff. One of the things with the reorganization was that we realized that there was data spread all across the campus. And our office in institutional effectiveness and planning had almost no visibility to any of it. So we should ultimately be the stewards of a lot of institutional data, and yet we were left out of these conversations. That started to change with the reorganization, but you still had a lot of data that existed historically that was in a silo. So student activities had been collecting orientation data for years. The problem was they didn't know what to do with it. They had no segmented analysis, so they just had numbers. They just had averages. They said, well, students like this 4.5 out of 5 or 3.7 out of 5. But they had no context for which students, what groups those students belong to. They had a really low completion rate regarding their survey design. And they also didn't have the capacity from a standpoint of human resources. They didn't have people who were devoted to data analysis on their team, or who necessarily even had strong data analysis backgrounds. And that's not a criticism of them, but rather just an understanding that that's not a skill set that necessarily is always going to be listed at the very top of a job posting in student affairs. And so you just didn't have a lot of people with a lot of data skills in that office. And so they had been collecting data, but not really doing anything with it. So this was an opportunity because with all these challenges, there's also opportunities. The opportunity from my standpoint was I looked at orientation and I saw a captive audience. I saw students coming to campus with their parents in a lot of cases who could be sitting in mandatory sessions and who could be given a very quick survey instrument. And I thought, ooh, this is good for response rate. We're always worried about response rates. Here's a way we can guarantee almost a 100% response rate. We have this really captive audience. We also had a really structured orientation schedule. So that was very helpful when thinking about how do we want to assess this and understanding that even though orientation might be taking place at different times throughout the summer, it was a very structured schedule. And that provided time for continuous improvement, both between orientation sessions. That's a quick turnaround, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But it also provided that opportunity between fall and spring orientation and then fall to fall orientation, there was time built in to develop really meaningful continuous improvement strategies using data. So what were some of the solutions? Well, a few of them are listed here. One was developing better outcomes. When I sat down and talked to the staff in orientation and student activities, they all kind of looked at me and said, well, here are the outcomes we have. And I said, okay. I said, are those the outcomes you want? And they weren't as thrilled about that. They said, no, not really. And they're like, well, we really don't know what this is measuring or what that's measuring. And so this was something where we wanted to make sure that we had outcomes that were going to be meaningful and actionable for the staff. And that's a great place to start. If you take nothing else out of this, it is about thinking and developing a foundation. And so, yes, there's this kind of technological foundation I talked about with Heliocampus and Tableau, but from an assessment standpoint, the foundation is always outcomes. That is a foundational thing. If you don't have good outcomes, if you don't have good goals, if you think about outcomes, sometimes that can be vernacular that's used more on the curricular side. A lot of times on the co-curricular side, people might not use the term outcomes, they might say goals, but whatever terminology you might use at Lindenwood, that's the basis. That's the foundation of good assessment. If you don't have good outcomes and good goals, assessment's not going to be very meaningful no matter how much data you collect. I had a former vice president who used to joke that she was in an institution before she came to the one I was at with her, in which she said one of the general education outcomes was embrace diversity. And she just kind of shook her head and she said, listen, I love the sentiment behind it. I want, but how are we assessing embracing diversity? That's an outcome that is just not accessible. Or it can be, it's just so difficult, so broadly assessed that it loses its meaning. And I would say the same thing. I would echo that you want to make sure your outcomes are meaningful, that they're actionable, that they reflect the mission of the office, the mission of the institution, or the mission of the task, in this particular case, orientation. So we weren't necessarily talking about developing outcomes for all of student affairs, but rather very pinpointed outcomes just at orientation. It's also an opportunity to redesign the survey. That was something that I've done a lot of at St. Edward's, was the surveys that had been being done institutionally. Again, a lot of this had been siloed. It was just people creating surveys on their own. We use the survey instrument Qualtrics, and we have an institutional license, for better or worse. That means everybody can go in and create their own survey, and that's exactly what everybody was doing. And the problem was those individuals, again, no fault of their own, but those individuals didn't necessarily have a background in survey methodology. There was staff and leadership turnover, and so new questions got shoehorned in, old questions got eliminated. It was really, really messy. And so when I started to get into some of this, I realized we needed to redesign a lot of surveys at the institution. We started with orientation. We've expanded out to almost every office on campus now. And we don't try to, in institutional effectiveness and planning, we don't try to own all of the surveys, but we do try to provide our expertise and our survey methodology to all offices that are willing to listen to us. And that is everyone. So that is nice at the institution. But this was a great opportunity to develop a shorter survey. So going from closer to a 25 question survey down to about a 10 question survey. There were some of those questions were multi-parted, but it was still, from a student standpoint, it looked like a 10 question survey. And so even though we were able to collect a lot more data points than just 10, it was still a pretty quick survey to go through. And being administered during a mandatory session to make sure that we had a very high response rate. And then finally, with the analysis, this was really a great part. So with orientation concluded over the summer. There were 6 orientation sessions, but each one of them would conclude on a Friday afternoon. And so it was like a Thursday. Students arrived on a Thursday, spent the night, and then Friday they would do the kind of last part of their orientation and then leave. And they would leave a little bit before lunch. And so their last session was around 11 o'clock. This was the session where we administered the survey. I knew that. And so therefore I knew that we would be getting all of our data fed into Qualtrics between 11 and 11:25, because that's when the session ended. So I knew that by noon at the latest, I could pull the data down from Qualtrics. And that's exactly what I would do, is every Friday I would just set a timer on my calendar. I would pull the data in from Qualtrics. And we were only talking, and the beauty of this is we were only talking about maybe 100 students in each orientation session, so it wasn't an overwhelming number. And typically by 2 o'clock, so within 2 hours, I was able to provide staff of orientation immediate feedback. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that might look like. But certainly by the end of the day, Friday, I was able to build up these dashboards that then the orientation staff could use in their debrief on Monday morning. So this was a very quick process where quite literally students would complete a survey, data was pulled down almost simultaneously from them completing it, pulled into Tableau, dashboards are developed, interventions are made, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. But then by Monday morning, by the following business day, essentially, the staff is able to reflect on the results of the survey. So with that said, I wanted to actually show and share with you some of the data that we've collected and how it was presented to the student activity staff. So what you're looking at here is overall satisfaction of orientation by gender as well as race ethnicity. So you'll notice that we have our race ethnicity broken into 3 categories: Latinx, non-Latinx students of color, and white. Interestingly enough, our non-Latinx students of color, despite having significant racial diversity within that group, tends to actually look the same in terms of their responses on surveys. So even though you have Asian students, African-American students, Middle Eastern students, you have a lot of different students in that population, their responses on surveys, not just on orientation, but across a lot of surveys at our institution, they tend to show very similar attributes. So blending them together as one group is necessary from a statistical standpoint. Certainly from an N standpoint, it was necessary, but it also is not betraying the essence of that data. But you'll see that we have our 3 primary racial and ethnic groups. And you'll see that we have a kind of dial button up there at the top right corner that allows for the student affairs staff to go through and analyze the results for each of the 6 orientation sessions that were held throughout the summer. This is just a screenshot, so it's not dynamic, but if you were on our internal Tableau servers, you would be able to click around here and kind of just point and click your way to getting those different results. This is showing the results for all 6 sessions combined. And this is on a 1 to 5 scale, from not satisfied at all to extremely satisfied. And so what we found was that really strong levels of satisfaction, but we did find that our Latinx students, and this is a trend that we kept seeing over and over again, did have higher levels of satisfaction than our other 2 groups, non-Latinx students of color and white students. And so this is like I said, this is something we see over and over again. But this is an example of a very broad snapshot of just kind of one variable, one question, overall, how satisfied were you with orientation, looking at that in a more segmented manner, in a very simple bar chart, and being able to toggle between different sessions to look at how that might be variable from session to session, depending on the personalities and the dynamics that are in the room, or the size of the orientation sessions, et cetera. So, or even sometimes the weather, that has a huge impact on this. Texas can get hot over the summer. So when it's 105 degrees, people may not be as thrilled about coming to St. Edwards as they are when it's 90 degrees and sunny outside. So that can have an impact as well. So this is a very simple display. And one of the things that I would emphasize is whenever you're talking about data visualization or using data, is to start simple. Don't overwhelm anyone, for that matter, with too much data. I think that's one of the things when you have data visualization tools, when you have an office such as ours that have people who have strong data backgrounds, there's a desire sometimes to do the really cool, nifty stuff. What you have to understand is a lot of times people don't understand the cool, nifty stuff. Sometimes an average, a percentage, a bar chart, a cross tabulation that you're about to see, that's all you need. And it doesn't need to be any more complex than that. Yes, there's a time and a place for predicted probability models. This is not the time and the place. This is about just getting a sense of where the data is to get a better sense of how we can serve our students. So this is a crosstab that looks at, and I mentioned the highly structured schedule of orientation. So this actually looked at how valuable students found each of the individual sessions that took place during orientation. Again, on a 1 to 5 scale, from 1 being not very valuable to 5 being extremely valuable. Again, you can toggle between the different orientation sessions on the right-hand side, but you're looking at this segmented by gender as well as race, ethnicity again. And so yet again, you're seeing some interesting trends here. Crosstab can be overwhelming, especially when you look at all these numbers. The beauty of Tableau is that by visualizing a crosstab and adding some color to it a little bit differently, your eyes automatically are drawn to the darker colors and the lighter colors. And that's exactly where they should be drawn. The darker colors are your highest scores, the lightest colors are your lowest scores. What we're finding here pretty simply is 2 things. One, we discovered our Latinx students had found the most value out of nearly every session compared to other groups, both male and female, and particularly our male non-Latinx students of color consistently found the least value out of these different sessions. So this was kind of an interesting result to find. That on one hand, and this is where segmented analysis I think is particularly helpful, because if we were to just look at students of color broadly, we might miss out on this analysis. But because we have such a significant Latinx population, we're able to extract that population out, look at that separately from the non-Latinx students of color, and that allows us to, I think, have a much more granular view of the data to say what's going on here, why is there this variation that's taking place? And interestingly enough, our white students tend to really reflect the attitudes more of our non-Latinx students of color than they do our Latinx students. Within the content of the sessions, it's not surprising to see that registration and those initial success coach advising sessions are the ones that have the, the highest scores. Students always get really excited about that part of orientation. And I'll talk a little bit more about some of the sessions that have lower scores regarding the continuous improvement that was developed around how to enhance those sessions overall. So we then asked a series of agree, disagree questions, and it was related to various elements of the outcomes related to orientation. Now, this was from the first iteration of orientation we did back in 2018. So some of these outcomes were still the old outcomes that I had mentioned. Some of these were the new outcomes that we were developing. So that's why you see so many here. But again, being able to toggle through different sessions to see that variability segmented by race and ethnicity, or gender and ethnicity, I should say. And we were asking students statements and asking their level of agreement from strongly disagree to strongly agree. So whether or not they gained a greater understanding of the mission, whether they were more familiar with academic programs, whether they were more uncomfortable with their success coach. And then at the very bottom, we asked a question of whether or not they were excited to enroll at St. Edward's in the fall. And that question served as a huge indicator for us. We would expect, and we would hope, that students would either agree or strongly agree that they were excited to enroll at St. Edward's in the fall. If they responded anything other than that, And as you can see from the numbers, this is the 1 to 5 scale. So overwhelmingly, I mean, the average was 4.75 is the grand total average for that question. So a huge percentage of our students did say agree or strongly agree. But some students would say disagree, or neither agree nor disagree, or even strongly disagree in some instances. This is where that initial pulling down of data on a Friday afternoon was really helpful, because I didn't have to sift through all of the data to try to find a potential issue. I went directly to that question and I filtered by score or by response. And I said, did we have anyone who said they either strongly disagreed, or neither agreed or disagreed to being excited about enrolling at St. Edward's? Because that indicates we might have an issue. It might be something as simple as homesickness. It may be something that's indicative of something larger, of a problem that might end up causing issues from a retention standpoint once they start enrolling in the fall. So can we triage some of these issues? Can we deal with some of these issues quickly? So I was able to kind of isolate that and isolate the specific student. Again, this is the results are confidential but not anonymous. So I'm able to isolate the specific student, and I'm able to connect with that student from the Student Success Center and connect them to their coach, et cetera. So those are the sorts of things we're able to do with this data. Again, similar trends. Our non-Latinx students, male students of color, tended to have lower scores. Our Latinx students tended to have the highest scores of all groups. Now, this next slide shows that we can go well beyond just race and ethnicity and gender. One of the narratives that existed at St. Edward's was that we did not do as good of a job as we should on retaining our highest performing students, our honor students. And so I was able to bring in honors status through the Heliocampus extract created in Tableau. And so I was able to connect students' responses to whether or not they were marked to be in the honors program. And I was able to compare the honor students' responses to those of non-honor students. And what we found was a validation of this kind of narrative that we had heard, that our honor students were less satisfied, found less value, were less engaged in the orientation process than our non-honor students. And in some cases, as you can see here, pretty significant difference, a half a point in some cases. And those sessions that you see where it's the largest gap on the top end, the history and tradition, diversity and inclusion, late night orientation, those events were taking place late in the day. And it seemed as if our honor students really checked out by that point and really didn't find the benefit and value in those. They did find value in registration, very academically minded students, not surprising. And then we also had career orientation sessions that were focused on how to get internships and how to build a college resume. Interestingly enough, our honor students didn't particularly, they found a little less value in some of those traditional ones, but they did find a lot of value in the more introspective sessions on knowing thyself, which was about kind of being reflective and being true to yourself about what sort of job you want. And so what sort of career you're looking for, what sort of vocation in the broadest sense of that term you're looking to engage in. So it was interesting to see where our honor students actually popped and had higher than normal responses and where they were a little less excited and less engaged. So this was also extremely helpful for the orientation staff to develop continuous improvement strategies based around the engagement of our honor students. So outreach. As I mentioned before, I would go right to that question about, are you excited about enrolling at St. Edward's? And if they said, maybe not, typically by 2 o'clock that day, I would have a list of students who said they weren't particularly, they didn't agree with that statement, who were not excited about enrolling. And it was never many, it was maybe 3 or 4 in each orientation session, but I had that list and I had information about those students. So I had their race, ethnicity, their honor status. I also had their current academic program. I had their home address. I had all of this other information. I sent that to our director for student success, and she was able to reach out to those students literally within hours. So remember, orientation ends at 11:30. I'm pulling down the data by 12. By 2 o'clock, I'm sending her this list of potentially disgruntled students. And typically by 2 or 2:30, she's reaching out to those students or their parents to follow up to go, hey, how's everything going? And it wasn't like, hey, we saw your survey response. It's just more, how are things going? What's going on? How are you feeling about coming to St. Edward's in the fall, and trying to get more? We were able to, I know this because anecdotally it was shared with me, we were able to triage some of these issues as students were driving home from orientation. So by the time they even got home, the situation had been smoothed over, it had been resolved. There was one instance where the student just simply did not like the person they were going to get roomed with. They just, personality-wise, it was oil and water. And so we were able to triage that situation and do it quickly rather than letting it fester. What's interesting is the student never mentioned that there was a roommate issue in the survey, and there was an opportunity for them to do so. But again, they said they weren't so excited about enrolling. That was an indicator for us something was wrong. We were able to reach out. So there was two types of continuous improvement that took place. One was this immediate continuous improvement, getting results from the previous session that finished on a Friday by Monday morning. And typically there was a 2-week window until the next orientation session. What changes needed to get made in between these sessions? Logistically, what needed to happen, programmatically, what needed to happen, et cetera. So there was a short-term continuous improvement strategy. How do we need to better engage these different populations? But there was also a long-term continuous improvement action plan that was developed. And then the other great part from our standpoint was once people started hearing about what we were able to do with orientation data, suddenly my inbox got very full. And so the Office of Recreation and Wellness wanted to start partnering together on different assessment projects. The Office of the President wanted to work on different projects. The Office of Student Success wanted to work on different projects. So by starting in this one area, which was, I think, a pretty easy lift in all things considered, suddenly it provided our office a big victory. It provided the student affairs people a big victory, but it also spread the word of how assessment could be used in a meaningful way and in an equity-based way of looking at segmented analysis by different populations, looking at Pell status, looking at race, ethnicity, looking at gender, looking at first-generation status. Oh, we could pull in all of these different variables, and we did for different projects that we partnered with on those offices. So to provide a little bit more context to how did we do a deeper dive into improving orientation using this data? Well, there was two things. First, a task force was actually created based upon the data that was shared at orientation, and it looked at the entire first year experience. And we defined that as from initial connection to the institution really through the end of their first year. So orientation was a huge part of that. That task force brought together faculty, brought together staff from admissions, orientation, and advising, as well as students, both transfer students and our native student population. So that task force worked on a lot of different recommendations, retooling what the entire first year, but also orientation looked like, what the onboarding process looked like. And so this was, like I said, you're talking about institutional level changes that are taking place regarding the way orientation is structured, the way some onboarding is done in our learning management system, the way that students are engaged with advising and success coaches and when that happens, and just the programming at orientation is changing, and the programming throughout that first year is also shifting pretty dramatically. So we're talking about really substantial changes that were taking place based upon a little bit of orientation data. It was also about confronting data, and it was about, and I'm going to have that as a term throughout, making meaning, upending narratives. And it's about saying, what does this mean? And it's about not being defensive about the data, but understanding how that data is going to ultimately help drive improvement moving forward. And understanding that there might be results that run counter to what we would expect and to run counter to our mission. I mean, particularly when we started seeing those non-Latinx students of color being a little less engaged, excuse me, that was something that was really concerning, I think, for a lot of people, because while we are a Hispanic serving institution, our social justice mission is broad. And the fact that we were not serving, or maybe not being as effective at serving, those non-Latinx students of color really forced our faculty and our staff to confront some issues there. So we also did several things based around the honors program. And this was a year-to-year change. So one was we just developed more programming that placed an emphasis on educational achievement, highlighting educational accomplishments of the incoming class, highlighting the incoming SAT, ACT scores, highlighting all of the Fulbright scholars that we have on campus, and emphasizing some of the things that we know institutionally are true about St. Edward's, but that we realized we weren't sharing. Orientation was so much about rah, rah, aren't you excited about coming to college? Let's make friends, let's hang out, let's see what Austin is, let's get excited. There was none of this, hey, you're coming to a really amazing academic institution. And that's what our honor students wanted to hear. And so giving them more of that really ended up having a beneficial impact on their scores. Orientation schedule is also reduced to prevent overwhelming. One of the things I didn't mention was that we also gave students a personality test. And it was kind of like a Myers-Briggs. I like having data. So I asked if I could see the results of the student personality test. I said, sure. And what we discovered was that 80% of our honor students are introverts. And only about 45% of our non-honor students are introverts. Now that's not surprising, but it is important to keep in mind when you're putting together a program. I'm a natural introvert. Through years of teaching, I've trained myself to seem quite extroverted, but I am a natural introvert. And I know that if I had to start orientation at 8 a.m. and orientation didn't really end until 8 or 9 o'clock at night, I would be completely wiped out and completely checked out, because having to not fake it, but having to appear extroverted for 12 hours is about all I can do. And so it is an overwhelming task. And so what we discovered was that it wasn't that our honor students didn't necessarily like the programming. It was that they were just done. They were checked out after 12 hours of orientation on that first day. And it's not surprising that the sessions that they actually found, registration, if you remember, they were quite fond of, that was the very first thing on the next day. So they had a full night's sleep, they get up, very first thing, registration. Hey, that's valuable, that's great. So reducing that schedule. And then also we did some stuff to reallocate more money for the honors experience, because honor students had gotten broken out. This was something that like everybody kind of pointed at each other. Nobody knew it was happening. But honor students got broken out and had a separate breakfast from everyone else. And the director of the honors program would often pay for it. Well, we had a transition in the honors director role, and there just was some miscommunication. And so most of the students got these great breakfasts, breakfast tacos, which is a staple here in Austin. And they got, pancakes and eggs and bacon. And the honor students got like cold bagels. And so it's just like, hey, why don't we help out with the honors? Why don't we help out the honor students get a better breakfast? And so just like helping them get a better experience and it's not a lot of money because it's not many honor students. I mean, you're talking about 85 maybe overall spread across 6 sessions. So you're talking about maybe 8 to 10 in any session. And, it made all the difference in the world. So some of those continuous improvement strategies are really small, like what I just described. Others are more systemic, more institutional. So I'm going to transition now and talking about assessment in general education. And as I mentioned earlier, general education is something that has a lot of challenges. We completed a general education renewal that took place, or the new gen ed started in the fall of 2018. As I mentioned before, the previous general education curriculum had lasted for over 2 decades. The previous curriculum was highly scaffolded, and therefore not a very large number of faculty actually participated in teaching in the gen ed. Just to give you a little bit of background, the highly scaffolded courses were all in these interdisciplinary, it was an interdisciplinary discipline called Cultural Foundations, CULF, CULF. And the CULF courses were taught by what we refer to as university studies faculty. These were faculty who, some were full-time, but a lot were part-time. They came from a lot of different backgrounds. But what you didn't see was a lot of the disciplinary full-time faculty were not engaged in teaching gen ed. And they weren't engaged in the general education assessment process at all. So this was a real learning opportunity. As I said here, opportunities, see above, because these challenges really are opportunities as well. We're starting something brand new, great. That's an opportunity to start over from scratch rather than trying to change assessment processes in midstream. I've done that before, and that's not particularly fun. So starting with something new is exciting. Full-time faculty hadn't really been engaged in gen ed assessment. Great. They don't have a bad taste in their mouth. Like they don't have a negative experience associated with it. This is all brand new to them. Wonderful. Let's build out a really positive structure. So there were, even though these were challenges, they were opportunities as well. And then also we had devoted leadership. We had an associate vice president for general education. She had someone who provided support for her. Obviously, our office was providing support. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of the devoted leadership roles in terms of general education curriculum coordinators for the different requirement areas. So what were some of our solutions to this? Well, first, again, foundational, developing outcomes. So we achieved 6 overarching outcomes that we felt embodied our general education curriculum. Those 6 outcomes were derived through a very iterative process where faculty provided feedback. We sent out surveys to faculty. And when I say we, I mean the Associate Vice President of General Education and myself would send out surveys, soliciting feedback, getting faculty to vote on the outcomes, et cetera. So very faculty-driven process at arriving at those 6 overarching general education outcomes. Curriculum mapping. Once we had those 6 outcomes chosen, each general education requirement area mapped to no more than 2 of those outcomes. Say, okay, so as an example, natural science as a requirement. Which 2 of the 6 outcomes, or maybe even just one of the 6 outcomes, is natural science mapping to? What does that mean is all of the courses that fulfill the natural science requirement could be used to assess this particular outcome. Natural science, if I'm not mistaken off the top of my head, I know they map to problem solving and innovative thinking. That was one of the outcomes that they mapped to. And then finally, equity-based assessment. And this is where I was able to leverage what we've already been doing on the co-curricular side and sharing it with faculty on the curricular side to go, look at how we can look at data. We can look at data in a really segmented way to look at race, ethnicity. We can look at Pell status. We can look at first generation status. We can look at all these things. And it's about an institutional view of assessment, which is really important because the old gen ed model was a course-based view of assessment, that each course assessed its own achievements and proficiencies. And so it was an analysis of how the course performed. This is more outcomes-based. So yes, we're collecting data from individual courses, but ultimately this is about how are students performing on critical thinking? How are students performing on problem solving and innovative thinking? How are students performing in communication? That's happening all across a lot of different courses. And it's not about drilling down to your specific course and kind of wagging my finger if your students are a little below average, but rather looking at these larger institutional trends and how are students performing. So the great part about this was we had the opportunity to essentially do a trial run. So simultaneously, and maybe even a little bit before this, we were brought into a grant opportunity through AAC&U, the American Association of Colleges and Universities. We partnered with 6 other universities to do something on assignment redesign, and where faculty, essentially submitted artifacts for scoring from a particular assignment, got data back, redesigned the assignment, and resubmitted the data for the next, from the next year's group that they gave that new redesigned assignment to. The beauty of this was the metadata. AAC&U wanted to have an equity-based approach. And so they asked us to go through the process of collecting artifacts, connecting those artifacts with individual student record level data. So to say Matthew DeSantis submitted this artifact. Matthew is a white male, non-Pell eligible from Pennsylvania who is a political science major, okay? And who has achieved, 62 credit hours, we'll just say, and it's transferred from Austin Community College. So you're getting all of this data. So what you would do is you would get all of this data, but then you would do 2 very important things. 1, you anonymize the artifact. 2, you anonymize the data. So you assigned a random student ID number and you removed student identification in the name of the student, but you still had all of those student attributes that you can connect back. So it made us realize 2 things. 1, it made us realize how many of these variables we have, but it also made us realize how easily we could pull them. And also, maybe a little bit of bragging, it also made us realize how quickly we could pull them compared to other schools. That the metadata ask from AAC&U, I was able to pull down that information in 20 minutes, 25 minutes. And this was a huge metadata lift for some institutions. But I was able to get this for the students that we needed in really a fraction of the time. I mean, over my lunch break, honestly, and that's not trying to brag. It's just how quickly the system works. And when you have an integrated system, that's just the beauty of it. But we were dealing with a smaller number. We only had about 200 overall artifacts that we were doing this for. And because 15 faculty were engaged in the process. And this was really great because it was a smaller scale. So we were able to kind of go through what was the pulling of the data going to look like? What was the scoring going to look like? How were we going to visualize this? We were able to go through this kind of trial run with a smaller subset of faculty. And then they started to spread the word about, hey, there are these really cool results we're getting. We're seeing this data in really interesting ways. This assessment data doesn't look anything like what we thought assessment data should look like. And so that started to get other people on campus excited. So I wanted to share with you some of the results from the AAC&U grant very quickly. Remember, this was not a systematic random sample. This was kind of a convenience sample. Faculty who volunteered to be a part of this process, and then we did pull a systematic random sample of artifacts from their classes, but it was still a convenience sample regarding of what classes we were able to pull from for this particular grant. And again, this is just around 1 assignment for critical thinking and intercultural knowledge. And I'm sharing with you the critical thinking scores. The thing that really jumped out to us was, oh my God, we have a huge gender gap issue. Where women were just outperforming men on every dimension. And this was true in intercultural knowledge too. So every single dimension across both outcomes, women outperform men. It was statistically significant on 2 of the 5 here. It was statistically significant on 3 of the 6 in intercultural knowledge. And we're talking about a small n. So it takes a lot to be statistically significant. One of the things you'll notice here is you can actually toggle between race and ethnicity, or gender and race, I should say. So this screenshot is looking at gender, but you could easily toggle, and if you were looking at this live, you could click on that little dial next to race, and you could go back and forth to look at how results differ by race, ethnicity. We actually didn't find a lot of variation in race, ethnicity, which was positive. We actually took a lot from that. And then we saw our overall scores, again, putting those in the proper context, that most of the artifacts collected were from 1 and 2,000 level courses. Therefore, on a 1 to 4 rubric, we would expect a lot of these scores to look around where they were. Now, this was what was really fascinating, was we looked at the scores by gender, but we looked at the scores by gender of the instructor as well. So this was something that it was something that our Associate Vice President of General Education just kind of threw out there as an idea. And she said, I wonder what sort of impact gender and instructor gender has on this. And I said, well, we can look at that. And so it was also easy because we only had 15. So, and I knew all of them. And so it was easy to kind of, easily kind of connect the artifacts to the classes that were being taught and the gender of those instructors. So this was what the gender gap looked like overall, okay? This is what the gender gap looked like for courses taught by men. So in courses taught by men, the gender gap, I'm going to go back for a second, the gender gap actually reversed. Now, what's interesting about this, and this is where you have to kind of go inside the data a little bit more, is that women actually didn't perform any differently in courses taught by men or taught by women. It was men that simply overperformed, if you will, in courses taught by men and dramatically underperformed on the artifacts in courses taught by women. This was a really, really, really interesting finding for us to contemplate and to interrogate further. So again, how did we confront this data? We confronted this because there was some skepticism and pushback in the room. When you start talking about equity and you start talking about, and one of the things that I didn't show was on intercultural knowledge, our white students had the lowest scores. So when you start talking about equity and you start talking about a social justice institution, and then someone like me walks in and goes, we really need to be focused more on white men, that doesn't go over great initially. But that's where the data showed, was that white men were really underperforming and that our students of color were doing just fine in the grand scheme of things. And so that forced us to confront a lot of issues, that when we think of equity, it needs to be universal. It needs to be, if there is a gap, even if that gap is from a supposedly privileged population, we need to address it and we need to understand why that exists. The interesting part was we were able to do that in a really fun way, which was all of the instructors shared their assignments. And we realized that a lot of this variation was probably because of the nature of the assignments. Almost all of the women in the grant, almost all the women instructors had assignments that were reflective. And it was about reflecting and kind of not necessarily always emotional, but certainly reflecting and kind of, it was very introspective. All of the assignments by men were much more structured. To say, it was more of a research paper. It was more of a traditional, write an intro, what's your argumentation, write a conclusion. Like, it was very structured. They were great assignments on both ends, but it was so interesting to see how the assignments for men looked different than a lot of the assignments by women. The fascinating thing was that the men who participated in the grant were from completely different disciplines across completely different schools, teaching completely different levels of courses. So it wasn't as if we just got a bunch of history faculty who were all male and, well, of course their assignments are going to look different. We had history, we had math, we had humanities, we had psychology. We had people from all different backgrounds teaching all different levels, and yet their assignments all looked very similar. And so we realized that, well, maybe we could meet somewhere in the middle. Maybe some of these assignments that are really structured can have some reflection, and maybe some of these reflective assignments, if we put a little bit more of a traditional research structure around them and kept a reflective element throughout, we might see some of those gaps disappear. So continuous improvement was a 6-month process. Each of those faculty worked with our Center for Teaching Excellence to redesign their assignment. And it was a significant overhaul, multiple meetings, kind of peer learning, and working with those people in the Center for Teaching Excellence. It was really great. And like I said, the process helped on our end perfect what year one assessment looked like. So what did year one assessment look like? So general education in year one, we looked at 2 of the 6 outcomes. We were particularly interested in critical thinking and intercultural knowledge. And so within critical thinking, we decided to pull a systematic random sample of artifacts from the Writing 1, Global Perspectives, and Exploring Artistic Works requirement. And from intercultural knowledge, we decided to pull, again, a systematic random sample of artifacts from modern languages and diverse American perspectives. So those were our requirement areas that we were pulling artifacts from. The important thing here was that we had a lot of partnership and a lot of communication. This is going to be critical if you're trying to pull off this sort of institutional assessment. We had our AVP of general education, and she was really leading the faculty engagement process. Each general education requirement area had a designated faculty coordinator. So for each of those 5 areas listed above, Writing 1, Global Perspectives, et cetera, there was a designated faculty leader, basically, in each of those areas. So the AVP of Gen Ed would communicate with the faculty coordinators. The faculty coordinators would communicate with the faculty teaching the courses in that particular semester, which was the fall of 2019. And we were able to make sure that faculty were very aware of the expectations in the process. On the more kind of staff side, the Office of Instructional Technology, I partnered with them, and they were able to provide me access to all of the courses in the learning management system. We use Canvas. So she provided me access to all of the Canvas courses that we were going to pull artifacts from. And so that took her a lot of time to get, just it's tedious, and I appreciated her doing it, but adding me to all of those courses. And then what I do is part of that faculty expectation and process is that faculty complete a form that lets me know the name of the artifact that they would like to have used for assessment. So what I do is I'm now loaded into their learning management system. I'm loaded into their class for Gen Ed. I now know, because of the form they filled out, what assignment to look for and download. And so I go and retrieve the artifacts from the learning management system directly. And that's when I start my process of anonymizing, connecting to a student record level data, et cetera. So faculty have a very minimal lift in this. They're teaching the course, they have to designate an assignment, but otherwise we are handling the more technical aspects of this. So what did year one actually look like? Well, once we got all the scoring done, and I should actually take a moment to say the scoring that takes place afterwards is once the artifacts are extracted and anonymized, we went through a pretty robust norming process in the spring. We had over 40 faculty and staff participate in the assessment of critical thinking and intercultural knowledge. All artifacts were double scored. All faculty went through a 3-hour norming session in which they normed 3 artifacts collectively based upon which outcome they were going to assess. And they were using rubrics that we had developed institutionally, that the faculty themselves had developed institutionally, based in large part off of the AAC&U value rubrics. But again, this is using kind of a 1 to 4 rubric scale when you're looking at this data. So once all of that was done and the assessment data was inputted in a Google Sheet, I just simply connected the Google Sheet data back to the anonymized student record data and pulled everything into Tableau, and we had our Gen Ed year one dashboards. And this is, again, critical thinking. And this, again, you can toggle between gender and ethnicity. This is looking at ethnicity, looking at it across the different dimensions of the critical thinking rubric. You can see that our Latinx students are performing quite well. We actually see our non-Latinx students of color performing a little bit lower, and our white students looking a bit more like our non-Latinx students of color or somewhere in the middle. If that sounds familiar to the first part of my presentation about orientation, welcome to St. Edward's. This is what we see. And it's exciting that we are serving our Latinx students as effectively as we are, that they have a sense of engagement. We see it in graduation retention rates. They're very high. We do have an issue with our non-Latinx students of color, though. And we do have an issue with our white students to some extent, being a little bit less engaged than we would expect based on their academic profile. But we're able to kind of see this snapshot. We're also able to kind of drill down into more granular data. And this is, I'm not going to speak through everything on this screenshot, but it provides you a sense of the intersectionality that we can provide. So this allows you to toggle between different ethnic groups, but it's looking at Pell status as well as transfer status. So looking at students and even some granularity within that transfer status. So looking at students who are transferring from four-year institutions like Baylor or the University of Texas, transferring from two-year institutions like Austin Community College or Blinn Community College or Alamo Community College District, as opposed to our native students at St. Edward's who were started as first-time freshmen. And again, being able to look at that by different ethnic groups. And we could do that for gender, we could do that for different, first-gen status, et cetera. We could do that for different things. So you can really get a lot of granularity out of this data and still really drill down into its meaning. This was particularly interesting. This looked at the scores by level of course. So I didn't want to drill down too far here because I didn't want people to think we were spying on their particular course, but it was interesting to look at how 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 level courses had their artifacts scored across the different dimensions. So here you're seeing for the critical thinking dimension explanation of issues, your 1,000 level course had an average score of 3.33. Your 4,000 level course actually had a lower score. Now, from an assessment standpoint, we would start going, oh my God, this is awful. Our students are getting worse as they move through the curriculum. This is not what we want to see. You'll notice if you look at the cross tab at the bottom that the scores at the 4,000 level actually are very high and are higher than those at the 1,000 level for most of the dimensions. However, what was really interesting about this was that the type of course that was being taught at the 1,000 level was our Writing 1 course, which was a highly structured writing class in which students went through multiple iterations of an assignment before submitting the final version. So they went through about 2 or 3 feedback processes where the faculty member provided feedback and they would go back and refine the assignment again, submit it again, get more feedback, to do it again. So there was a iterative nature to perfecting that assignment so that the artifact that we ended up with was actually quite strong coming out of that 1,000 level. And I think it speaks to assignment intentionality, pedagogical practice, and it really shows that our students can achieve really high levels across these dimensions, even if they're first semester students, if we have the proper structure placed around them. So it was a really, I think, at first we were a little alarmed, but when we dug into the data, it was really meaningful. So the results, well, just as this picture here shows, the faculty were all smiles. They loved the equity-based assessment approach. They loved that they were interrogating big ideas. Faculty, and as a former faculty member myself, and I still teach actually at St. Edward's, one class a year, but I still get to stay in the classroom every once in a while, which is nice. But, faculty like thinking about big ideas. And if you start throwing them these big institutional level results, they start thinking about, well, what does that mean for the institution? How can we overcome that? It's not about their class. It's not about their assignment. It's not so granular. It's not so kind of minimal in some ways. That doesn't mean to undermine the importance of a particular class, but it also takes some of the burden off of faculty. The idea is that, yes, faculty own the general education curriculum, but the achievement of learning should not be the responsibility of faculty alone. And so the idea that critical thinking and looking at these learning equity gaps, this should not be something that is just on faculty. Well, you need to do a better job teaching so that these groups all perform at the same level. No, there may be institutional factors that are at play, particularly when you see some of the same findings from orientation surveys pop up in gen ed assessment. And you go, wait a second, these two things are happening in very different areas, and yet we're getting very similar results. Maybe there's a larger issue we need to confront here. So faculty were really excited about that approach. And like I said, it was an opportunity to engage the institution beyond just the curriculum. The continuous improvement, and this is where that was so great, was that year, that the trial run of AAC&U, our Center for Teaching Excellence was ready to roll on assignment redesign. And so our director is ready to she's already working with faculty who are interested in engaging in developing more intentional assignments based upon what they saw with these results. That those 2,000 and 3,000 level courses, you don't get the same sort of iterative assignment structure, that same sort of intentionality in some cases. And so there's a lot more focus now on developing that within the faculty and doing that across discipline. Again, not pointing fingers at individual faculty, but saying this is something that's good across discipline and across the institution. So just to give you a little bit more sense, we're getting close to the end, but to give you a little bit of more sense of the way in which we continue to engage gen ed assessment through this use of data. Extended engagement. This data is being shared across the institution, being shared with multiple general education committees, multiple assessment committees, multiple committees across the institution, whether they're gen ed or assessment or not. The general education requirement coordinators get kind of an initial view of this. Faculty get to see this. University leadership gets to see this. This is something that is shared with the entire community. Because it's shared with the entire community takes ownership and is invested in trying to come up with a solution. So this is not data that we want to silo. We want this data to be shared. And that's true at orientation too. Because at orientation, the reality is that orientation staff partnered with a lot of different offices to develop all of that programming. We didn't let orientation data exist just in student activities. No. Orientation data was shared institutionally. Executive memos were shared with the cabinet. We were sharing this high-level results, administrative results, staff-level results. We were sharing those with everyone. So really, like I said, I can't speak enough about the democratization of that data and really the proliferation of it across the campus. Confronting data. This is also extremely important. Making meaning of null findings. So one of the things you noticed with the gen ed data was there wasn't a ton of variation. There was a little bit, but there wasn't a ton. And, in terms of Pell status or transfer status, and sometimes that can be disheartening, but it can also speak to, well, geez, why is, I can't believe that our Pell eligible Latinx students aren't performing at a lower rate than our non-Pell Latinx students, for instance. Well, what sort of support structures do we have in place around some of those different student groups? I talked at the very beginning about our CAMP program. Our CAMP program has 360-degree wraparound support services. Those are all Pell eligible Latinx students. Some of those ended up in the gen ed artifact sample. Guess what? Those students overperform because they have, and I shouldn't say overperform, they perform at a very high level because they have wraparound support services. Maybe we need to think about those wraparound support services for other populations, other groups. So even though you don't see these huge differences in findings, first of all, that's a good thing. And second of all, what are the best practices that we're engaged in that maybe are helping some populations that we could extend to others. And then continuing the momentum towards year two and new outcomes rather than continuing to assess the same two outcomes again. I think one of the things when faculty saw this, they got really excited and they're like, let's measure critical thinking and intercultural knowledge again. And I had to be like, we're not measuring it again. We're moving forward to this year communication, problem solving, and innovative thinking as our two outcomes. But having a designated group of people who is focused on a continuous improvement strategy for critical thinking and intercultural knowledge for the next 2 years. That's the beauty, is you have this 2-year loop now, and then critical thinking and intercultural knowledge will come up again. Once we've assessed all 6 outcomes the first time, we'll loop back. Now critical thinking and intercultural will get assessed again. And now we could have significant institutional changes that we're documenting and taking place in that time. So that's, I think, a real a benefit. And having faculty know that we're not losing sight of what we learned, but we can walk and chew gum at the same time, essentially. We can do the continuous improvement on these 2 outcomes while continuing to collect new data on future outcomes. So finally, what are some lessons learned? It takes a village. And here's a beautiful image of our main building and the very famous Texas Bluebonnets in the foreground. And it is a beautiful campus. If you ever have a chance to come to Austin, Texas, please do come by St. Edwards and drive through. It's a really pretty campus. What you see here is the coordination of multiple offices engaged early and often. Just communication is so important in assessment, because to pull something like this off, you need to have everybody knowing what we're doing, knowing what the big picture is, understanding the kind of understanding the processes, understanding the expectations, and understanding the timing that's going to be needed to pull off some of this stuff. So you're coordinating instructional technology, assessment, institutional effectiveness, faculty, student affairs, student success, recreation and wellness, health and counseling center, residence life. You're engaging all of these offices, for something like orientation. That really is that's just a fraction of who you're engaging for that process. You need everybody to be aware of what's going on. You also need to have data capacity, to do some of the things that I showed you, with the visualizations, with being able to connect to student information extracts. That's something that's really important to have. The staffing capacity. It should be noted, we don't have a huge staffing capacity, but we have a great technology. So ideally you have both. Ideally you have a lot of staff and great technology. But if you have great technology, you don't need quite as much staff. And if you have great staff, you might not need quite as much technology. So, that's kind of the trade-off sometimes. So you need a staffing concerns. What sort of software capacity do you have? What's the institutional culture around assessment? And both on a co-curricular or non-academic side as well as on the academic side. And then finally, and again, goes back to something I said at the very beginning, institutional commitment to align the assessment process with the mission or the strategic plan. We are a social justice institution. We are doing equity-based, social justice-driven assessment processes. That makes meaning for people. That makes assessment meaningful, it makes it practical, and it makes it something that's worthwhile doing. So whatever your mission is, whatever your strategic plan may be, connecting assessment with those ideas is of the utmost importance in terms of making sure that there's success, because that makes the data more meaningful. Because if you collect data, but it's not connected to the mission and the underlying strategic plan of the institution, then what are we doing with the data? What's the data showing? Okay, or it's just very siloed. It doesn't have this broad applicability. When you can show data that directly speaks to the mission and strategic plan of the institution, you can go and share that data with every office on campus and it's applicable. even if the content of the data may not have derived from that particular office. So that's what I think is so important about aligning assessment and data collection with mission and strategic plan. So I want to thank you. It's been a real privilege to speak with all of you about the use of data and developing equity across the campus. I wish you all the best in the Certificate in Culturally Responsive Assessment at Lindenwood. As again, my name is Matthew DeSantis. You find my information here. And academic Twitter is a thing, so I included my Twitter handle at the bottom, at MattDeSantis80. I will promise you that 90% of my tweets are about higher education. As I briefly mentioned, 10% of my tweets, I'm from Philadelphia originally, they may be about Philadelphia sports, and so I do apologize for that. But I will try to keep on task and try to keep focused on academic as much as possible. So thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it. I wish you all the best, and please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. Take care.